Vladimir Putin says that he would not allow Ukraine to create its own nuclear weapon and nuclear capabilities. Does it mean that such creation of nuclear deterrent could undermine Putin's narrative and could put even more pressure on him and could become a big disaster for a Russian war effort? What is your take on that?
Well, again, this is a very complex issue. We know that Putin has been threatening nuclear strikes really virtually every day for the whole of this, 900-day plus war. So, I think Putin is bluffing when he's threatening nuclear attacks into Ukraine. Now, of course, if Ukraine had its own nuclear capability, I think that would make it even less likely. Putin would not want to, however extreme and crazy people think he is, I don't think he wants to spark a nuclear war because that would end his own reign. And, he's a very selfish person. He likes to think he is a great leader like Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great, but he clearly isn't. So I think this is a challenging situation, but it is the right time to have this discussion because I agree with your assertion that actually this gives something else for Putin to think about. We know that the Russian military has taken a severe hammering from the Ukraine military. They've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft. We know the Russian economy is at the point of breaking. And if it wasn't for countries like China buying cheap oil off them, it would have already collapsed. So I think things are getting more difficult for Putin. And he knows that, if things keep going badly, that's going to be the end of his reign as the autocratic tyrant leading Russia at the moment. So I think it goes back to it's very, very important that NATO and the US absolutely give Ukraine everything they need so that they don't have to go down this nuclear pathway. And once they have prevailed, once Ukraine's prevailed, then it would be appropriate for them to join NATO to make sure that a conflict like the Ukraine war does not happen again.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte confirmed that North Korean troops are being deployed to the Kursk region of Russia. These forces are part of an elite unit of the Korean Army, according to the New York Times. Also, we have seen one interesting publication by the Wall Street Journal. There is intelligence information that those forces which are deployed to the front line in the Kursk region are young teenagers in their early 20s. They are poorly trained, untrained, unprepared for such major war, and the soldiers appear relatively short and have some problems with nutrition. From your perspective, is this elite the best? What does Kim Jongun have?
Well, it might well be. They might be the elite North Korean forces. We know that the North Korean army is poorly trained and poorly equipped. And I would have thought Kim Jong-un's main concern is South Korea. So I expect his elite forces are actually on the boundary between North and South Korea. But Kim Jong-un is desperate for nuclear know-how, nuclear technology. And this may well be the quid pro quo, as we call it, that Putin wants. Putin is running out of conscripts. He's desperate not to start making his oligarchs and supporters send their sons to the front line because that's the way the Russians work. And of course, what happened the last time that the sons of the elite were forced into the Russian army had to withdraw from Afghanistan in the 1980s when the mothers of Russia marched on the Kremlin. So I think Putin is very concerned about that. So he's happy to take any soldiers from anywhere. And, it sounds a terrible thing to say, but these young North Korean men are purely cannon fodder. They've obviously been press ganged into it. There are reports that they're already trying to desert and trying to get safety into Ukraine because they've been press ganged, as it were, into it. there are reports that there are further 10,000 North Koreans on the way. So yeah, I think this is an escalation, and quite rightly, President Zelensky should call it out, and by suggesting that Ukraine might try and acquire a nuclear capability is in relation to this. So I put the blame firmly on the Kremlin and firmly on Putin. I think actually from a military perspective, these soldiers will make very little difference. I think it's just shockingly callous that these barely trained young men from halfway around the world are being sent to their deaths, and probably none of them are volunteers. They're being forced to do it. And it's clear that they're not well trained or well armed. In other words, haven't got good equipment. So I think this is very callous by both Kim Jong-un and also by Putin.
Also, North Korea also has deployed its 500 officers to Russia, including 3 North Korean generals. What can this indicate?
Well, I'm sure this is part of the deal that Putin and Kim Jong-un have got together. No doubt the North Korean generals want to have a say in what their soldiers are doing. So no doubt they're invited into the senior command. But I expect, few of them speak or understand Russian. I can't believe that the Russians are going to, really listen to them or heed what they say. But it seems an awful lot of officers for the amount of men that's deployed. But if it's like the Russian army, maybe they need those officers to make sure that those soldiers actually go to the front line. Certainly the way the Russians do it is the officers stand behind the soldiers. And if the soldiers don't want to fight, the officers make sure they do. And in some cases, actually shoot them if they don't fight. So again, I think it is just showing what a poor military capability that North Korea is giving to Russia, and it is probably in return, as we've discussed before, for nuclear technology, so that the North Koreans can develop their own nuclear weapon. But I think actually it probably won't make a great deal of difference to the front lines themselves. But again, it is escalation, and therefore the US and NATO should help Ukraine escalate by giving them all the equipment they need, and most importantly, allowing them to use US and British weapons to strike targets in Russia, where a lot of the missiles are launched from that attack schools and hospitals in Ukraine.
If Ukraine goes after North Korean generals, would it be a huge blow to Kim Jong-un? And does he expect this? Because they would be legitimate targets for Ukrainian armed forces.
Well, there'll certainly be legitimate targets. I don't suppose the Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, cares very much. I think he has similar sort of morals to President Putin. In other words, none at all. Doesn't care about casualties, doesn't care about collateral damage. So they of course become legitimate targets if they enter the war. But it's a bit like, President Putin seems to care little for casualties on his own side, and certainly, he gets rid of his own generals at an alarming rate. So, yeah, it's probably sad individually for these people, but I don't think Kim Jong-un cares one jot about his soldiers, and would not care if they were killed. All he's caring about is his own position as leader and getting military capability like nuclear weapons, so that he can try and expand his tyranny as Putin is doing in Ukraine.
Also, Ukraine urged North Korean troops to surrender, promising food and shelter, according to the I Want to Live project, which is active and funded by the Ukrainian government. From your perspective, do you personally expect mass surrenders by the North Korean soldiers, and could they even support the Ukrainian side?
Well, that's a lot of questions, I think. It's clear that the North Korean soldiers, certainly the information we're getting, do not want to fight. and it's clear they're being very badly treated by the Russians. So the offer of food and safety, I expect, if they could surrender en masse, they would probably do it. But no doubt the Russians, as they do with their own soldiers who try and surrender, shoot them themselves. So yeah, I'm sure given the option, they'd surrender and come under the command of the Ukraine military. But I can't believe that the Russians will allow them to do that.
Do you expect further escalation in the cooperation between North Korea and Russia? A Wall Street Journal suggested that this first deployment of the North Korean troops to Russia, 3,000 troops, could be a beginning of something bigger, of something more. Also, Kim Jongun could assess the reaction of his population to this decision, and later he could deploy even more cannon fodder to Russia and Ukraine. What is your opinion on that?
Well, that's the possibility for the Ukrainians to send more the North Koreans send more troops to Ukraine. Yeah, is very possible. The North Koreans have an army of over 1 million men, so they've certainly got people there. And I think that Kim Jong-un, the leader, doesn't really care about his population. So we know that it's an autocratic regime, and anybody who shouts out or complains against the leadership is put in jail or even worse. So I don't think there will be much. We won't hear much from North Korea if the mothers of these soldiers start to complain. So yeah, that's just the way things work in North Korea. But certainly, if Kim Jong-un is happy with what he's getting from Putin and the Kremlin, then I wouldn't be at all surprised if he's happy to send more of his manpower. But I think one must also realize that North Korea and South Korea have been in a sort of state of war for many, many years, and probably the number one priority on Kim Jong-un's mind is to make sure that he has a strong military, so that they couldn't be overrun by the South Koreans. And there's no indication that South Korea wants to do that. But then, Kim Jong-un is not a rational person, and probably wouldn't think that way. So this needs to be looked very closely. It is escalation, and the West and NATO must react to it to ensure that Ukraine can prevail in this conflict as soon as possible.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin said that he would not be ready to any kind of concessions or compromise with Ukraine. At the same time, the head of the President Zelensky office, Andriy Yermak, said that Ukraine is ready to conduct negotiations with Russia in case of Russia's withdrawal from the territories which have been occupied since February 2022. Do you still think that it is possible to force Vladimir Putin to negotiate in good faith with Ukraine?
Well, I'm rather cautious and not terribly confident that Putin will negotiate in good faith. Nothing he's done really since his time in office, and certainly nothing since he invaded Ukraine, shows that he has any good faith at all. The thing that will get him to the negotiation table is if Ukraine forces push the Russians out of the territory that they've seized since the 24th of February 2022, and also potentially the areas they've seized since 2014. And how they can do that is by NATO and the US giving them the capability to do it. And I think everybody would like to see peace in Ukraine, in Europe, as quickly as possible. But it's clear from President Zelensky that, the conditions need to be met, and those conditions are not right at the moment. Putin is, I think, clinging on to power now. No doubt there are hawks in the Kremlin and in Moscow who are circling, looking for any weakness in Putin so that they can take over. And I don't think a new leader in Russia would be necessarily a bad thing, because I expect they would want to reset and the economy in Russia is in a dreadful situation, and the military is much denuded as well. So I don't think anybody expects to have a ceasefire negotiations anytime soon. But if we in the West can help Ukraine more, then that might force Putin's hand and force the Russians to the negotiation table.
Also, we have heard some reports about the Russian elites, which becomes more aware about what is going on with Russia. There is criticism of Vladimir Putin's actions even on Russia's state television. So Georgy Zyuganov, Communist Deputy of Duma, he supports war but attacks fact that 40% of budget going to military and calls it unsustainable. We have followed the wrong approach for 10 years, he said. Also, he declares that Russia's budget is a madhouse. Also, General Gerashenko on Russia's governmental TV, on state TV, said that lots of money are being taken from the poor people to the war against Ukraine. Also, there are lots of criticism of this war effort against Ukrainian armed forces. Does it mean that Russian elite is becoming more aware about the situation and could even sometime in some day in the future put pressure and turn against Vladimir Putin and his war effort against Ukraine?
Well, it's certainly true that the Russian public seem to know, beginning to understand what's actually happening in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing, and the hundreds of thousands of people, Russian soldiers, who've been killed. So in a way, that is a good thing. And the fact that 40% of Russian economy is spent on defense, and we know that the Russian state is so corrupt that probably, at least half of that money is probably not going to tanks and bombs and bullets. It's going into the pockets of corrupt leaders within Russia. So, I too have heard the comments on state Russian TV and complaints of the way Putin is running things. So I think that that is a good indicator that actually people are running out of faith in Putin, beginning to question really seriously what he's up to. And if we look what happened with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan back in the 1980s, it is following a similar pattern. So hopefully this will develop further and will force the Kremlin to withdraw its troops from Ukraine so that we can have that ceasefire and peace negotiations that I think everybody in the world wants as soon as possible.
And my last question for you, I would like to cover the situation on the Middle East and the involvement of the West in this conflict. How do you see the most important, significant event on the Middle East for the last days and hours, and how is it related to Ukraine and the support from Western allies to Ukraine's war effort?
Well, unfortunately, I think the two conflicts are inextricably linked, and the common denominator is Russia. Russia is getting missiles from Iran, and Russia is probably providing nuclear technology to Iran as well. But I think that last week's attack by Israeli Defense Force on various military sites in Iran using US aircraft, the F-35Bs, which also contain British technology, really should be a guide for the US and the UK and others to allow Ukraine to do similar. I see no difference from Israeli forces attacking Iranian sites with Western military equipment to Ukraine being allowed to do the same to bases in Russia that are launching attacks against Ukraine. So, now that this has happened, and this is the second time that Israel has attacked directly into Iran, it really makes the argument for Ukraine to be able to do the same using Western military equipment into Russia very, very strong. So let's hope that that is reviewed very soon, because that would be a game changer, I think, for Ukraine to be able to do that. So both conflicts are linked. Russia is the one that is stirring both pots, if you like. Putin likes to see the international community focused on the Middle East so that they don't see the war crimes that he's committing in Ukraine. But he is naive if he thinks that's the case. So the main thing is that we in the NATO and the US must allow Ukraine to attack into Russia, as US has allowed Israel to attack into Iran.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.